Hey everyone, Tin Man here, and the new Dota Underlords patch that was promised earlier this week to address the Primordial and Arc Warden meta, as well as adjust Hunters, has finally come. So let's take a look. Here in this general section, the first topic here, there's not a whole lot to cover. Most of it's kind of behind the scenes UI and optimization stuff, as well as a couple bug fixes, so nothing too interesting. The main change here is Arc Warden. Arc Warden was a big menace of the past meta with his ability where he would create a copy of himself, and then if that copy had enough mana, would cast another copy, and so on and so forth, and by the end of the fight, you'd have a dozen Arc Wardens all dealing damage to the opponent. They've completely reworked him, and he is now still an interesting unit, and I don't know if he'll still be top of the meta, but he's very interesting. So the cost has gone up from 3 to 4, so now he is a tier 4 unit, along with things like Doom and Kunkka. And they've adjusted his stats accordingly, increased his health, and rather substantially increased the attack speed from about 0.059 up to 1.0. But more importantly, his ability has been reworked. It now casts at 0 mana, so it'll cast right at the start of the fight, rather than having to build up mana over time. And it now says, Arc Warden creates a copy of himself with the same health he currently has. The clone can use all of Arc Warden's current items and will attempt to attack the same enemy as his summoner. Whenever this clone dies, Arc Warden will create a new one. So essentially, it limits Arc Warden to only having 2 at a time. But you'll get 2 right at the start of the fight, and they'll both have the same items and can use them both. So this completely changes how you're going to play Arc Warden. No longer will it be in a Crystal Maiden build with Blink Dagger and just all of these kind of ways to generate mana. Now he's much more interesting in using items that have either effects that scale off his strong attack speed, something like Maelstrom perhaps, because you'll have 2 Maelstroms now attacking reasonably quickly. Or you can use him with like one time per battle effects, things like Dagon or Pipe of Insight, to kind of double dip on those effects. I don't know exactly what the logic is on where it summons right next to him, so it may be hard to position Pipe of Insight correctly with it, but something like Dagon, which doesn't care about positioning, it would be very interesting to use on him now. So great change to Arc Warden. Kind of still keeping him interesting, keeping him relevant. They didn't just say, oh, the copies no longer deal damage to summoners or to players, because that would be like a dramatic rework of the unit, a dramatic nerf, and just an explicit nerf. Whereas this is a rework, and it's very interesting, and it opens up new possibilities that I think are very interesting because you get the copy right at the start of the fight. Whereas before, you had to build up the mana, and it would take some time, and then it would cast before you could get the double item. Now it casts right away. Very cool, and I'm curious to see how it will fit into the new meta. There are some other changes in this patch, things like Clockwork, who they reworked in the past to 3 cost and just kind of like minorly buffed his stats to compensate, and it really wasn't enough. He was really garbage, and no one ever really played any of the scrappy inventors at 3 cost. So this is a rather substantial buff, doubling his armor at level 1 and almost doubling it at 2-star, and a pretty substantial buff to maximum health up by about 150, and then 200 at rank 2. So this is really big, and I might be much more inclined to try Clockwork now. I know I kind of wrote them off because I didn't really think the buffs were enough, but this is a big buff, and I'm curious to see if Clockwork now might be a more interesting mid-game option for you. They also buffed Medusa a little bit. She was struggling a little bit at 5 cost. She didn't really pull her weight, and games weren't really getting to 5 cost because all the Arc Wardens were eliminating you very quickly. So small buff to her attack damage. And Tinker also got buffed just like Clockwork for the same reasons. Let's see, his attack speed slightly increased. Actually, his armor got reduced pretty dramatically. So maybe he'll be more of this like backliner rather than frontline, trying to take damage to gain mana, because now he doesn't have quite as much armor to survive. But in any case, they weren't played too terribly much, and I don't know if they'll come into the meta. I doubt it, but they may be like a cool kind of mid-game option that, hey, if you get this to 2-star, maybe you can kind of carry your mid-game from rounds 15 to 20 or something before you transition to a better late-game strategy. Treant Protector was also reworked. They kind of over-nerfed him. They kind of raised him up to 3 cost and then didn't really compensate enough, so they've increased projectile speed, which really just says that whenever the heal triggers from the Leech Seed, everybody who was going to get healed by it will get healed faster. So I don't think it affects his cast time and how long it takes him to animate and cast it. And the Leech Seed damage and heal has been buffed by 20 damage, 20%-ish. Still, I don't think this is really enough to bring him to like the dominant force that he was whenever his heal radius was much larger. But a reasonable buff because he was basically unplayable in his current state. Another big change here. Lycan, one of my favorite units. Lycan has changed from human warrior savage to human hunter savage. So that is a change I did not expect. Whenever they said they were going to adjust hunters, I was willing to bet a good chunk of money that they were going to change it to a 2-4-6 alliance bonus, rather than the 3 and 6, to give you a little bit more of a mid-game option to go to 4 hunters rather than go up to 6. Because that required Medusa at 5 cost, which was inconsistent and hard to get. Instead, they added a new hunter to the pool. They added Lycan and removed it from warriors, which is fair because there was a lot of warriors, especially when they made Tide Hunter a warrior. So now Lycan is a hunter, and that changes both warriors and hunter builds. So unfortunately for hunters, let's start with hunters first. Hunters don't really have a natural savage that they want to put in. Unless you're interested in druids and you're going to go like lone druid Treant plus 6 hunters. And that's a lot more feasible now because you have Lycan to give you that savage bonus along with you now have the 7 hunters, so you don't need Medusa anymore. This will make that composition very weak to magic damage though, because they will not have the scaled buff because you don't have Tide Hunter and Medusa anymore. But I like the change just adding a new hunter, but I'm not really sure how he's going to fit into a lot of the compositions other than just played as another hunter. I don't know how well you can take advantage of his savage or his human traits in a lot of cases, especially because there's no other human hunters. And things like Kunkka have been nerfed pretty substantially recently. So we'll have to see how this plays out. This just dropped recently. I haven't had a chance to really test it out, but we'll see where the hunter comps develop from here. On the other side, the warrior compositions are definitely affected as well. A lot of warrior builds would often start with, Tusk and Lycan as just your two warriors you're definitely going to play, along with you had the options of the 4-cost units like Doom and Kunkka. And then if you want to go for 6 warriors, well, pick any 2 other ones. Normally Slarter and Tide Hunter to get the scaled bonus. But now you have a lot more, I'll say flexibility, but it's kind of weird if you're removing an option to say you're now more flexible, because it's definitely a nerf to warriors because they don't have that option to play Lycan as a warrior. But it does mean that now they can play other savages in the spot. So now they can play the Lone Druid, they can play the Venomancer or Sand King along with Tusk to get the Savage bonus. No longer is it like, well, I don't want to play those units because then I'm not being efficient because I could have played Lycan instead. So you now have this interesting build where you can go like Tusk and then Venomancer as your 2 savages, and then you add in like Necrophos and Pudge to get the Heartless bonus, and then you still run the same 4 warriors that I mentioned before, Slarter and Tide Hunter for scaled, as well as Kunkka and Doom for just really good individual units. And suddenly that's a good 8-unit composition with 6 warriors, 2 savages, 2 warlocks, 2 scaled, and 2 heartless. Rather than Lycan, who kind of would say, well, you can't play Tide, or you can't play Venomancer unless you're going to go up to 4 savages, for instance. So we'll see how these warrior builds develop. I think warrior savages were very strong in this patch beforehand, but this is a big change, and we'll see how that develops from here. I think they'll both be great, and I really, really like this change. Juggernaut has got minor buff. Attack speed is increased at 2 and 3 star, and his damage has increased very slightly. That's fair. Juggernaut was pretty much unplayable outside of Forged in Battle, and even then he was like backseat to Beastmaster in any case. So small buff, and that's reasonable. Item changes, Font of Creation. So these next 2 changes and the last 2 changes are changes to Primordials, who along with Arc Warden were just like the menace of the past meta. So Font of Creation, the health has been stabilized at 300 rather than scaling up, and the damage has been slightly nerfed. Okay, that's fair. That item was quite strong, especially with how strong Primordials were in general. You still probably pick it if you're playing a 4 Primordial build, but no longer is it going to be quite as oppressive. And then finally, and they really should have put this first, come on, Primordial Alliance has been reworked. So previously, it would disarm attackers with a certain percentage for 4 seconds. It would disarm ranged for 30% and would disarm melee 30% and disarm ranged with 10% chance. Now, at level 1, units that are attacking your Primordial units have a 25% chance to have their attack speed slowed by 50 each attack. This effect is applied at the start of attacks and ends for the duration of the attack. So that is a really weird sentence. And if you haven't tested it, you don't really understand what it means. So I did go into game and test this out. And basically what happens is whenever a unit is attacking your Primordial, there is a 25% chance that they're going to take a really slow attack. They're going to like wind up and then swing their weapon really slow, as if they were slowed by some effect that reduced them by 50 attack. Then once they complete that attack animation, they go back to regular attack speed. But they take a long time to make that one attack. And then the level 2 now has that same effect, but it applies to everybody rather than just your Primordials. So this is definitely a nerf, right? Because they were extremely strong beforehand, and I would be very surprised if this was actually a buff, if they are even stronger now. But it's just like before in the rework to Arc Warden, they are fixing it, but they're fixing a problem by reworking rather than by just straight nerfing, which is a lot better. It feels a lot better than just saying, oh yeah, I used to play this strategy and now it's just the same but weaker. Now you're playing a different strategy. It has different implications. I still think Primordials will be strong because you have got Tiny, who's amazingly strong at 1 star, or at level 1, not at 1 star, as a 1-cost unit. You've got Morphling, who was buffed in the last patch. He's great. You've got Razor, also a 1-cost unit. You've got a lot of these Primordials that are very early on in the game, and you're going to want to get this early Primordial buff in a lot of cases because you can get those units to 2-star quickly. And that'll just naturally lead to a lot of 4 Primordial builds, especially if someone finds a way to make this new Arc Warden very strong, like I said, with something like Dagon or something along those lines. So overall, I think this was an amazing change, and I'm really happy they got it out. It addressed a lot of the problems of the last meta, where Primordials were too strong, Arc Warden was oppressive, and Hunters were unplayable. And arguably Beast or Savage and Warriors were a little bit strong as well. So they've really adjusted all of them in a really elegant way, and I'm really happy with this patch, and I cannot wait to get into game and test it. So thank you so much for watching, and check out some gameplay videos of this update coming soon. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.